you recently moved to China. I'm adding you. You recently moved to China, very recently though. So could you share some of your insights about having made that move? And also, do you think that you're able to sort of gather some lessons about what the revolutionary task is of building a sustainable socialist sovereign country? And do you think that there are these lessons can actually be implemented in other countries? Like, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, no, that's right. A couple of months ago, I moved to China. I'm living now in Beijing. I'm working in Chinese media. On a personal level, that's absolutely an incredible country. Just the day-to-day life is so it's difficult to explain how refreshing it is almost to live in a country where the focus of the economy and of the state is in improving the lives of people, whether that's through the infrastructure, daily infrastructure that the people interact with, roads, buildings, public services, and technology, the way in which technology is integrated into daily life in a way that's actually helpful to people, I think is very extraordinary. In Western countries, people are often very suspicious of things like AI, like different technologies they feel are actually used against interest of ordinary people and for the interest of corporations. Whereas in China, people are actually very excited by technology because they know that it's something that is there to assist people rather than financial interests. And it really is extraordinary, especially when comparing, for example, to Latin America. China is a country that was in a very similar position economically to Latin America very recently, especially before 1949, before the establishment of the People's Republic, in which China was a colonized nation, an economically destroyed nation with high levels of extreme poverty. And today, China has managed to move in such a short period of time from being a colonized country into now having an economy much larger than their former colonizers. And that is the dream. That is the dream of every country of the global south, to be able to achieve something like that, to lift your entire population out of poverty, as China has done, lifting 800 million people out of poverty in just a couple of decades. That has happened here. I like to cycle around in Beijing. In Beijing, and they have, I think, what you call in London or New York as the city bikes, right? So these public bikes. In China, it costs the equivalent of about £1.50 for a month of unlimited rides. So it's essentially free. So I go to work every day on these bikes. On days off, I spend it, kind of cycling around all different parts of Beijing. And as far you can cycle out to the most far-flung district of the city, and the infrastructure is exactly the same as what you'd find in the city centre. High levels of public services and maintenance is absolutely incredible to see, which is something that unfortunately does not exist in Latin America or even many parts of Europe. So it's been an incredible experience. But also, I think politically, a lot of the issues that I mentioned, the weaknesses, the issues faced by left-wing governments, socialist governments in Latin America, being unable to control institutions of the state, such as the police and the military, that of course is not an issue in China. In China, you have every part of the state rowing in the same direction. You just recently had the unveiling of the new 5-year plan, which is, essentially the economic strategy they have. And once that is published, and by the way, before that's published, there's a long process of democratic discussion and participation where ordinary people and organizations, workers' organizations, unions, etc., can make suggestions to what goes into that plan. And once the plan is made, every part of the state is mobilized into implementing it into, with this long-term vision. I think that's so important. Unfortunately, in Latin America, even when you have a government with positive policies being elected, all of that can then be destroyed within 5 years if an election is lost or a coup happens. So all of the progress is constantly at risk. Where in China, you can have this sort of long-term strategy of development, which is massively important. There's the only way that you can make these historic changes is if you can have some kind of continuity and all of the structure of the state moving in the same direction. So that's very important. And then the other things I mentioned, like the issue of the way that the United States leads a propaganda war through social media. You mentioned the Great Firewall. I think will be seen as one of the great decisions of historically important decisions for Chinese society. And that doesn't mean that Chinese people do not have social media. China has lots of their own social media apps that are based in China. And in fact, all of the social media apps, such as Facebook and Twitter, were invited to come to China. They're not banned from China. They are blocked because they refuse to comply with Chinese law around things like data storage. But if they were to comply with Chinese law, they would also be allowed within China. But on Chinese social media apps, you have a huge amount of expression, whether that's cultural expression from China's numerous different cultures, but also people talk politics all the time. People make suggestions for what should, for example, go into the 5-year plans. People make complaints about things, say, if they have a complaint in regards to public services, for example, people will express that through social media, and you will often find solutions to these things. So I think there's the myth that China doesn't have social media or doesn't have free expression just because they don't have Western apps. They do have all of these things, just without the manipulated algorithms that you'll find on Western social media apps. Even things like religion, which I think is a massively important thing in Latin America. One thing I didn't mention, in which many of these processes and governments were destabilized, was actually the rise of US funded religious organizations in Latin America, evangelical Christianity, which is massively tied to the far right, that ballooned in size throughout the 2000s and 2010s, precisely with funding from the United States, with the intention of infiltrating working class communities and destroying the social base of the left there. And again, there's a misconception in China that there is no freedom of religion. That's not true at all. There's churches, there's mosques everywhere here in China. However, there are certain rules. For example, no foreigner can create a religious organization in China. That is incredibly important. Most of these fanatical, extremist, evangelical churches, for example, in Latin America, are established by foreign organizations based in the United States. That cannot happen in China because China is very aware that these are ways in which the United States uses to attack their enemy countries. So China does not allow that. China also has a law that foreigners can't donate money to religious organizations. So all of the funds that churches or mosques or temples have has to come from within China itself. It can't come from abroad. Again, all of these churches in Latin America, all of their funding came from the United States. I've personally seen in Bolivia, in working class communities, suddenly you see these enormous evangelical churches, 10 stories high, sorts of buildings that no one in the community would have the financing to build, but they build from one day to the next because they have enormous funding from their sister organizations in the United States. China does not allow that, because China is very aware about how that is. These things happen not for religious reasons or spiritual reasons, but for political purposes. So these rules that China has been able to protect China's sovereignty and protect the country over the past years. And it's the reason China is as strong as it is today. And I think all of these lessons are very important for governments of the left around the world. And I think we need to learn about these experiences if we want to build transformative governments everywhere.
That's so interesting, the point about religion, because if we kind of do this weird sort of analysis from what does China ban from the West, we can kind of see like all the different types of US propaganda tools. So it's kind of interesting that, I mean, it kind of makes sense as well that China, with such a huge population, would be able to see through a lot of these things. But it feels like for the rest of the world, like we're always being bamboozled by the US propaganda, like you said, in Latin America and stuff like that. When it's like we know what to recognize, it would be kind of obvious. It's kind of an interesting thing that you just said there that made me realize that. But yeah, cool. Thank you for that insight. Like, just a last question. What do you find is something that like the Chinese population is currently talking about politically that we might not know, or we might know from the West, like that might be a little bit surprising for us?
People who aren't involved in politics that has surprised me is that young people, especially in China, are very aware that the United States is trying to block China's development. And I say this is surprising because in the past, many Chinese people had a very positive, I wouldn't say positive view of the United States, but did not have a hostile view towards the United States. They saw them as, an important country on the global stage to cooperate with. But in recent years, we have seen, particularly among young people, the realization that the United States is not just another country, that the United States is actively trying to destroy the social progress of China, because the development of China is not about geopolitics or any of these things. It's about the transformation of people's lives, about lifting people out of poverty. And many of the, especially in big cities like here in Beijing, you talk to people, many people aren't from Beijing itself. Many of them will be from different provinces of the countries, many of them from families that grew up in very serious poverty generations ago, but now they have opportunities that their grandparents' generation or before that never had, because of the development that we've seen in China over the past few decades, particularly, but even before that, beginning in 1949. And so even among people who are not reading Marx every day or not particularly politically engaged, they're very aware that the improvements that their country has seen are at risk from the United States, and the United States has bad intentions towards the country, which is actually something, if you talk to most people, that didn't exist even 15 years ago, where people saw the United States as a friendly country, or as a more friendly country than it is today. So that level of national consciousness and of a kind of a national mission within China is very clear. And something you actually don't get, I think, in a lot of countries that are much more divided on issues like this.